To this, another episode of A Million Little TV Shows podcast. This is where we break down and discuss episodes of TV shows that you may not have even heard of. I believe these TV shows need a little more love, and that is what this platform is here to do. Each week we will be covering different shows from all over the globe. We'll be breaking down each episode, giving you the main highlights, and going through it bit by bit. But for now, I think it's best that we find out what's on the menu today. Hello there, and welcome back to this A Million Little TV Shows podcast. This is now season 7, and I keep saying it every season, but I cannot believe I'm here. This has now been going for 18 months, and I am not getting tired of it one little bit. I'm actually really enjoying this podcast so much, and it's such a pleasure to do it. So thank you if you are here listening. Obviously, if you aren't here listening, that's weird. But also, since I'm here, if you could go over and support me on Patreon as well, obviously will help this podcast grow a little bit more and I can start to do more things with it. It has been such a special project for me to do this over the last 18 months, and I want to thank every single one of you who's listened and hopefully continues to listen. So, what does season 7 entail? Well, we'll be picking up some new things and we'll be finishing off some series as well. So, as you'll have probably heard at the end of Season 6, we will be covering in Season 7, Hannibal Season 3. Now, obviously, that's going to be the last season of Hannibal until, hopefully, fingers crossed, that we get that 4th season that we've been looking for. Now, I am going to be covering Clarice at some point as well, in the not too distant future. So obviously we will be going back down this Hannibal rabbit hole. Obviously in that show, Hannibal doesn't appear, but it would be great if maybe both of those got a final series and it was melded into one, because I think the woman who played Clarice did really well from what I remember. It wouldn't be on the list of shows to watch if she didn't. And then we've got Ginny and Georgia Season 2, and if anyone knows what's going on with Ginny and Georgia, Season 3 is about ready. So it should be coming to our screens pretty damn soon, so I need to get Season 2 out so that I can cover Season 3 when it finally arrives. We've then got a couple of British shows, one called Night Sleeper, which is going to be the first season of that, and it's a very recent series. I watched this a couple of weeks back, thought it was excellent, and really wanted to cover it on the podcast just because it's so fresh in the memory. We then have Without Sin, which is a show from a few years back, but it was such a condensed show over only 4 episodes, and I really wanted to include it because there's some phenomenal acting in there. And then we've got Northern Lights, which is the show that I told you about last season, which broke me a little bit because it's very emotional, it's very intense and sad and happy and everything. I felt every single emotion during that show. So I really wanted to cover it because I think it's just one of the best shows I've watched in a long, long time. And don't forget, I do this as a fucking podcast. And so I think I've got a pretty good opinion on these kind of shows. But obviously, it is only my opinion. So you might have thought it was crap, but I'm going to cover it anyway. And then I'm going to be covering a Netflix show called The Baby, which was a weird horror show, but I really enjoyed it and I really wanted to cover it as soon as I started thinking about this project. And again, I started this 2 years ago, or 18 months ago, and this show was on it then. So it just shows you how long it's taken me to get to certain shows, and there's still more to come, including stuff that's coming next season that I haven't even watched yet because I wanted to watch it when it came out, and then I had the idea for this. So just warning you, there's going to be a lot of stuff coming. And as you may have heard on the National Treasure podcast, I've actually planned up to season 13. So you're going to have me for at least another year and a half. But anyway, let's get into today. So this is Hannibal, season 3, episodes 1 to 4. Episode 1, Antipasto. And so, as we may remember at the end of last season, Hannibal ended up getting into a massive fight with both Jack and Will, to the point where he gravely injured both Jack and Will. Jack was sat in a pantry bleeding out from his throat, and Will had been stabbed and was laid out on the floor watching Abigail Hobbs die. While on the outside of the building, Alana Bloom was also laying in a pool of her own blood, because she'd been thrown out of a window by Abigail earlier on. And in the very final scene, which I think I forgot to tell you about, we actually see Hannibal on a plane heading off somewhere, and he's got his therapist, Bedelia de Maurier, with him. And so that's where we pick up from. As he is on this plane, he heads out to Paris, and he heads to a function. He's Hannibal after all. He always ends up at a function somewhere, or he always ends up eating. We know he's going to eat in this episode, but he heads off to this function, and he goes to see a man named Dr. Fell. However, while at this party, he also meets a man named Anthony Dimmond, who is a former teaching assistant of Dr. Fell's, and who essentially sort of badmouths him to Hannibal. Hannibal is actually acting under an alias, because obviously his name will be out there from the FBI, so he doesn't want to be located. Much later on in the party, Hannibal waits outside, and Dr. Fell comes out. Hannibal says bonjour to Dr. Fell, and Dr. Fell says it back. Hannibal then spins his bike round that he's on and heads off. The next time we see Dr. Fell, he meets Hannibal outside his own home, and of course we know what's going to happen next. Of course, Hannibal is going to be eating, so he prepares some sort of meat and begins to eat Dr. Fell in Dr. Fell's own home. And so when Dr. Fell's wife comes home, she is also shocked to see him there, but also ends up dead as well. And this is all a ploy for Hannibal. Hannibal has one goal in mind, and that is he wants to become a curator in Italy. And so the next day, he and Bedelia head over to Florence, because it would seem that Dr. Fell was up for a job in Florence as this curator, but nobody knew who he was. So when Hannibal turns up, he takes the moniker of Dr. Fell, and Bedelia is Mrs. Fell. At this point, we have no idea of what has happened with Will. The only thing that we get from Hannibal's past is we keep seeing the fact that Hannibal is replaying things over in his head when it comes to Abel Gideon, and how essentially he curated Abel Gideon's body. For instance, in one scene we see that he actually serves Gideon his own leg, and in another we actually see that he is using Gideon's arm to breed snails, or to curate snails, I suppose, I don't know what the word would be, in order to fatten them up and actually have them take on the flavour. And we also find out that the diet that Abel Gideon is on, apart from eating himself, is actually to help the meat on Abel Gideon's body taste better. Now, throughout the episode, Hannibal has to go and meet with a man named Professor Sogliato. And this man is rude, and he's a smart ass, and he's a constant prick to Hannibal. I'm not saying that Hannibal should have deserved better, but this man should have been a lot kinder, in all fairness, especially when you think of who he's dealing with. But he's just a smart ass, he knows it all, and he doesn't like the fact when Hannibal turns up that this man essentially just shows him up. They're talking about Dante's Inferno, as this is the job that Hannibal has come over to basically do. Hannibal's job is going to entail having knowledge about Dante's Inferno, and so Hannibal has to prove his knowledge to this man. But every time he does, even then, this man is so smug that it doesn't matter what Hannibal does. He challenges Hannibal to actually give a lecture the very next day, which Hannibal takes up greatly. The next day, however, Hannibal ends up meeting Anthony, who has now come over to Italy as well. Anthony asks about Dr. Fell and whether he's about, because Hannibal has just come out of Dr. Fell's apartment, but he says, "Oh, you've just missed him." Hannibal invites this man to dinner with Bedelia and himself that night, which Anthony happily takes him up on. But of course, we all know what that means when it comes to Hannibal. But thankfully, now that he's come over to Europe, these tendencies have seemed to have died out on him. Apart from the fact that he killed Dr. Fell and his wife, he notes to Bedelia that he's made a conscious effort not to do anything like that anymore. And so they have dinner, but Anthony actually notices what Bedelia is eating. He asks if she is off the meat, and then we get a glimpse of her plate. And what's on there is exactly the same diet that Abel Gideon had. And so we can only suspect that he is trying to keep her sweet, so to speak, just in case he wants to eat her. And throughout the episode, we weren't sure of the dynamic between the two until this very scene. It would seem that she has her freedom and her autonomy to go out and do whatever the hell she wants. But now we know that she may be his prisoner. We also end up seeing in this episode something from Bedelia's past. And that is the day that she got attacked. Oddly enough, by Zachary Quinto, but obviously he was a different name in this, but it was quite clearly Zachary Quinto, as in Spock from the new Star Trek films. But the way that we actually see what happened with Bedelia is she wakes up and she is covered in blood down one arm. And then we get a reconstruction of what happened is she actually had her arm forced down this man's throat. And I mean all the way down. And so we don't actually see the attack happen, but we get it that it is implied that this man tried to attack her, but she's ended up with her arm in his throat. So we can't be too sure of what the hell's gone on. And it's suggested by Hannibal that he wouldn't have attacked her. However, anyway, during this dinner that they had with Anthony, it's suggested by Hannibal that Anthony come along to this lecture. Hannibal hasn't said that he's going to be there, he's just said Dr. Fell is going to be there. And so when Anthony turns up, he sees Hannibal there and knows the game that this man's playing. But because Bedelia has also seen Anthony, she thinks that he's going to tell the whole story, so she decides to make a run for it, knowing that she would be implicated with Hannibal, and she just wants to get away. Anthony, however, just doesn't care. He didn't care much for Dr. Fell anyway, and so he ends up going back to their apartment. Bedelia is just about to leave, but is interrupted by Hannibal and Anthony coming back. But straight away, Hannibal strikes this man with a very heavy object, and then he asks Bedelia, are you going to be participating or just observing? Bedelia doesn't want to participate, but Hannibal tells her that she already has. In the fact that she's here and the fact that he's here, she already has. Before he heads over and breaks Anthony's neck. After this exchange, we actually see Hannibal sat on a train and he's heading off somewhere. We don't know where. And as he does, we see a torso that is meant to be looking like a heart that is in the middle of this chapel. And at this point, we're not entirely sure whose it is because Hannibal is alone on this train. We can suggest that it's probably Anthony's, but what happened to Bedelia? Episode 2, Primavera. And so now we actually get the answer to what happened to Will, and in some regards what happened to Abigail as well. We get one of the final scenes from Season 2, where Hannibal both slits Abigail's throat and cuts Will open. But as Will starts to feel himself sinking into this bath of blood, basically, he ends up having his life saved. Because, let's not forget, before he actually walked in, after he'd found Alana Bloom outside, he actually called in the ambulance. So the ambulance would have been on its way when Hannibal actually left. In fact, we heard the sirens as he did leave. So they wouldn't have been that far behind. And as Will recuperates in hospital, once he comes out of this, what I can only assume is a coma, he's told by the doctor that someone wants to see him. And in walks Abigail, with a bandage on her throat, but otherwise looking okay. She suggests that maybe they should go and find Hannibal, because they were all meant to leave together. Hannibal had a plan, and they were all going to go away. But Will asks her, would you still want to go and be with him after all he's done? But she tells him, yeah, I would. He has essentially brainwashed her just like he brainwashed Will, just like he brainwashed Bedelia. And it would seem that, according to Abigail, he spared them their lives. Yes, he cut them open, but he did it with such surgical precision that he actually spared their lives. And so Will starts to think about what Hannibal had said to him prior to them actually getting into that final scene. And just as they were burning all the books that were in Hannibal's study, Will remembers something that Hannibal said to him. And it involves going to Palermo in Italy. And that is where he believes that Hannibal actually is. 8 months later, after everything that's happened, Will is finally able to travel out to Palermo and actually go and try and find Hannibal, and he's taken Abigail with him. He heads to a church where the body was found, and while he's in there, he gets noticed by one of the priests that's there. Will and Abigail begin to look around the chapel, and only a few days later, we end up finding out that this man's body is found in this chapel. And it's like a vicious cycle, because as soon as it is, Will is implicated once again. on the day of the investigation. However, Will is in the church and is taken to a station to be questioned. While he's at this station, he meets Rinaldo Pazzi, who has come over from Florence to Palermo to actually investigate this crime, because he believes that this is linked to a man called Il Monstro, who he dealt with 20 years earlier. And this man had a penchant for putting bodies into what looked like pieces of art, mimicking famous pieces of art, but with human corpses. Will believes this sounds very much like Hannibal, but doesn't say as much. And so, when Pazzi actually shows him a picture of a young Hannibal, Will realises that they need to start working together. They end up heading back to the chapel, and Will starts to use his ability. He starts to break down the scene and envisage what happened with this body being placed where it was. However, when he begins to see the stag again, which was dying at the end of last season, this visage is now coming back to him again. The black stag that had haunted him for the last 2 seasons was now back, which obviously meant that this was Hannibal. Most certainly Hannibal. But just as Will is getting to grips with this, he comes out of his trance at the behest of Abigail. Abigail begins to talk to him about what's been going on and whether it is Hannibal. And then we realise something about Abigail, as all of a sudden blood starts to pour from her throat, and we realise that this was all a figment of his imagination. Abigail had died that day. They'd not even managed to get her to hospital. And so we see a very interesting scene where both Will and Abigail are getting stitched up, but in different ways. So they are essentially preparing Abigail for a funeral, whereas Will is having his life saved. And we see the surgeries of both, which is a fascinating take on both the life and death elements of this. It's here that we also see Hannibal, and he's watching over Will within the chapel. Will begins to speak to, I believe he is a Detective Pazzi, and as he is, he's trying to explain to Pazzi that he doesn't really need to be there. He will catch Hannibal on his own, but having this detective there is only going to hinder him. It's at this point that Will starts to believe that Hannibal is actually in the building, and he heads down into a crypt, which is a fucking creepy looking place. And as he's walking around it, it is a basic maze. I can't believe how hard it was to actually find your way in there. As the camera turned at every point, I just felt more and more lost. Pazzi also comes down there and tries to investigate, but Will tells him to go back. He's no good down here, and if Hannibal is there, Hannibal's just going to be a danger to him. Pazzi heads back out, which again must be a feat on its own, and then we see that Hannibal is actually watching. Will heads deeper into this catacombs, I suppose, and Hannibal follows him until Will calls out Hannibal's name, which stops him dead. And then he tells him, "I forgive you," and Hannibal disappears. Episode 3, Secondo. And so now that Hannibal knows that Will is in town, he speaks to Bedelia and she wonders what is next for Hannibal and Will. Hannibal tells her that he's going to go somewhere where I can't anymore. He's already found out that Hannibal comes from Lithuania due to the fact of what Inspector Pazzo said. And so that's exactly where Will has gone. He's gone up to Lithuania to the estate of Hannibal, or the lectors at least. But once he gets up there, he finds out that it is very run down. The grounds seem very unkempt, and Will decides to break in due to a huge chain on the gate. However, when he does, he finds one solitary person on the actual grounds, and this woman is walking around with a huge shotgun. And so Will decides that he's not going to do anything just in case this person isn't friendly. He waits for the night time and heads inside the manor. However, once he is inside, he heads down to a basement where he finds a bunch of snails, which we found in the last episode, or at least the first episode, that was something that Hannibal dealt with on a regular basis. We know this because he used Abel Gideon's arm to help curate these snails. However, while he is in this basement, Will finds what looks to be a cell, and within that cell is a very gaunt looking man, as if he's been down here for a very, very long time. Will is then confronted by the woman, Chio, and Will begins to realise that this woman has been manipulated over many, many years to look after this estate and look after this man that is in this cage. Essentially, this man is the person who killed Hannibal's sister Misha, and not only killed her, but ate her as well. And Will deduces that Hannibal was testing Chio to find out if she would actually kill this man and have her freedom, or whether she would stay on the estate for the rest of her life just looking after this man, or at least the rest of this man's life. Chio didn't want to kill the man. It wasn't her thing. She isn't a monster like Hannibal. And so she stayed and she did her duty, which Hannibal wasn't expecting her to do. But now it's been many, many years since Hannibal's been back to the estate. We know it was at least 20 years since he was last in Europe. And however long he's been in, Baltimore, we don't know. Will, however, decides to test this woman's resolve as well. And so the man in the basement, he actually breaks him out. He takes him out into the woods and he shoves him out into the road, telling him to just go. The man, however, decides that he doesn't want to and heads back to his own cell, only to do one thing. When Chio actually comes to feed him on a night time, he breaks out and starts to try and strangle her. She spies something next to her, picks it up and stabs him in his neck. And so it would seem, much like Will, Chio just needed that last push. She tells him that now she has nothing else to be here for, that if he wants to find Hannibal, she will come with him and help, because obviously she is now a victim of Hannibal as well. Back in Palermo, we see another familiar figure fly in from the US. This time it's Jack Crawford. Thankfully, he survived the attack from Hannibal as well. I mean, we knew he did, we've seen the films. But as he is now here, he is not wanting to get involved in this investigation. And he meets Rinaldo Pazzi and tells him as such. And so when he asks, why are you actually here then? If you're not here to get Hannibal, why are you here? He tells Pazzi that he's here for Will, and only Will. Hannibal, however, has Sogliato come over, and he has dinner with him, he and Bedelia, to celebrate the fact that he is definitely going to be having this job. However, it would seem that Hannibal just cannot help himself right now. Bedelia believes that he is drawing the people to him that he's dealt with in the past, so in this case Will Graham, and now Jack Crawford. And he's drawing them in, and Bedelia tells him this just as Sogliato is sat waiting for something to eat. Hannibal just picks up an ice pick and puts it in his brain, and it's so swift. Even Bedelia doesn't see it coming. Even I'm sat watching it, and I was like, shit, I didn't realise that it was that quick. Bedelia begins to ask Hannibal what the hell he's doing right now. There are 2 people from the place that Hannibal is going to be working that have already died. How many more? And it's only later that maybe we find out that there could be more, because Hannibal actually has the Albeses come over, who are very well linked within the city. And of course, they're eating the finest meats, which obviously means that they are eating either parts of Sogliato or, in fact, Anthony Dimmon's body. And it would seem that Bedelia has deduced that Hannibal actually ended up eating his own sister. It would seem that he hadn't actually killed her, and that it was probably the man that was locked up, but somebody ate her. And Bedelia already asking the question of Hannibal of how his sister tasted, but he tells her that he ate his sister to forgive him for influencing him to betray himself. And now he feels that he needs to do something similar when it comes to Will. And so he feels that he must forgive Will by eating him. Episode 4, Aperitivo. And so we go back to the fate of everyone apart from Hannibal just after what happened. So obviously, just before the actual fight happened, the last time we saw Dr. Chilton was after he'd been shot by Miriam Lasp, because she believed that he was the one who actually had been manipulating her this whole time. And so while he was in an interview with Alana Bloom, Miriam grabbed Jack's gun, shot through the glass, and ended up devastatingly injuring Dr. Chilton. It was a shot to the face, and so we're sort of picking up from where that all left off, and it's kind of picking up the pieces of what everyone else has been up to while Hannibal has been off in Italy and France. And so Dr. Chilton, now with his reconstructed face, goes to see Mason Verger. And they have this weird thing, because obviously Mason was damaged so badly when he was eaten by those pigs, but also he has this perverse nature about him. He actually wants to see Dr. Chilton's old face, as opposed to this new one that has been fully reconstructed. And so Dr. Chilton actually has to take out the structural implants that are actually in his face to make it collapse, and also remove any makeup that's there to show the holes that are actually in his face, while Mason shows off the facial reconstructions that he's had as well. And they're both pretty grim in all fairness, but it's such a good makeup artist on this show that they pull it off really well. And so Chilton inquires about what Mason's been up to, because it seems that Mason has put out a bounty on Hannibal's head for any information regarding where Hannibal is, and he's put a bounty on him of $1 million, which of course Dr. Chilton would happily take, but he also wants Hannibal under his care back in the Baltimore mental institution, because Dr. Chilton would really like to study Hannibal. Mason, however, just wants him dead. And then we go and revisit Will Graham, waking up after his surgery, and we see a very similar scene to what we saw previously, where he wakes up, the doctor tells him that someone needs to see him, and then in walks what looks to be Abigail Hobbs. And as I'm watching this scene, I'm literally thinking, I've already watched this, why am I watching it again? And then it's revealed that it's actually Dr. Chilton who has turned up to see Will. And he tells him very much a similar story to what Abigail told him. In his terms, he wants Will to pursue Hannibal, but Will just isn't bothered. He knows that no good can really come of it, but he also knows what Dr. Chilton's like, and he knows that any information Dr. Chilton will have, there'll be someone who's in his pocket. Once Will's out of the hospital, Jack comes to see him. He was hoping that Will would come to see Jack, but he never did. Jack tells him that he wants to make sure that they're both on the same page about everything that went on that night, and Will tells him exactly what happened, that Will did call Hannibal that night, and he also made sure that Hannibal knew that Jack was on his way, and the FBI were on their way. When Jack asks him why he did all this, he tells him, it's not just because he was my friend, it's because I wanted to run away with him, which obviously seems to worry Jack at this point, because he didn't realise how much of an influence Hannibal had over him. And Chilton, obviously, while he's doing his rounds, he ends up going to see Alana Bloom, who is still alive as well. So apart from Abigail Hobbs, out of the main cast, everyone survived the attack that night. Alana, however, is in this weird contraption, and it looks like she's basically either broken her back or broken her hips or whatever it is. The way that she fell out the window, it was quite a cool shot. The way that they did it, they actually had her fly through the window and have like an outline of her skeleton, like we were looking through an x-ray of her as she fell, and then she hit the ground. And it seemed to be sort of ass first, so she would obviously have broken probably her pelvis. And she's in this weird contraption that's essentially holding her down by the looks of it while she's healing. But while she is there, she is essentially what looks to be in rags. And then you've got Dr. Chilton who just walks in casually, and he's quite a weird bloke anyway, and she's barely covered, the poor woman. Let's just say I certainly wouldn't want Dr. Chilton around me while I was in that state of undress. But this is just Dr. Chilton trying to grab more information about Hannibal and where he could have possibly gone. Once Alana is allowed to leave hospital, we see that she is in a wheelchair for a little bit, and she goes over to Hannibal's house. While she's there, she finds Will sat in the kitchen, literally where he'd been sat only months earlier, bleeding out. And when she begins to question him about what went on with Hannibal and sort of what's going to be going on next, he can't deal with any questioning right now, and he asks her to leave. Obviously, after 8 months, we know Will goes over to Italy. So this is a full 8-month gap where we're trying to fill in here. And it seems that Alana has gone from being bedridden to being in a wheelchair, and now she's got a new job and she's walking. The new job is that she is Mason Verger's new therapist. And when she meets Margot essentially tells her she needs to watch out for her brother's behaviour and his personality, because others don't tend to be able to deal with it very well. She also says something very chilling about, if he gives you chocolate, don't accept it, which we can only imagine means that it is laced with something. And we know that he's had issues with children before, and so was he lacing the chocolates for the children as well? Because that is creepy as fuck. He also tells her about the fact that he wants any information on Hannibal. And so at the end of the episode, after Mason meets with a man called Cordell, who is his physiotherapist, and it would seem that Cordell has other skills as well, Mason orders this man to prepare an area for when Hannibal turns up, so that Hannibal can be fed alive to his pigs. So after that meeting, we get another scene between Alana and Mason, where Alana basically tells him that she knows what his plan is for Hannibal, but maybe she can help him out. Maybe if he starts to look in Europe for the same kind of wine sales that Hannibal would have been into before, she knows that Hannibal is going to be living the life that he did while he was in America. And so if you're going to find him, find someone who is living a high life, who is new in that particular area. Now, Europe's a big place, but maybe he can start to whittle it down. And finally, Dr. Chilton actually goes to see Jack Crawford and sees if he is interested in going after Hannibal as well. But right now, Jack just cannot think of anything. And the reason for that is because Bella is in her final days. We see the devastation of what happened after his accident, or his incident with Hannibal, and he's actually laid in bed next to his wife, holding her hand as he's coming out of his own situation. But as the months go on, Bella just doesn't get any better. We knew she wouldn't. We knew it was terminal. And one particular night, after Jack notices that she's gone beyond, he assists her in her final breaths. Essentially, it looks as if he gives her an overdose, just to ease her passing. And Jack, who is quite a tough man throughout the whole show, you can see him break. The one person that he would have always broke for was Bella. Didn't matter who else was under his care, she was the one. And so at her funeral, he ends up finding a card from Hannibal. And this is what I believe brings him to go to Italy as well. And it would seem that he was going to go with Will. But just as they're in the planning stage, Jack goes over to see Will at Will's place. And the person that opens the door is Alana. And Alana tells him, "You're too late, Jack. Will's already gone." And in a very bizarre scene, we see Will sailing to Italy to go and confront Hannibal. Okay, so knowing where this season's actually going to end up going, it's been an impeccable start so far. I think with the fact that now they're hunting Hannibal, it just makes this so much more interesting. And to be fair, it's not like it's not been interesting at all. This is such a great series. And the visuals, the sound design, the makeup, it's all just fucking brilliant. And that doesn't even start talking about the acting and the direction and the script. It is all beautifully put together. Such detail. And even in that last episode, I felt a little bit lost as I came into it. By the end, I knew exactly where we were. I think the layout for this season has started perfectly. I wouldn't have chose this way myself. Not that I'm a director or anything like that, or a storyteller, but I just think that I'd have gone much more linear with it. But because it's shot the way that it's shot, it makes it feel better. I like the way that it is put together. It's just not what I would have done. But the way that Hannibal is, it's never been conventional. So having it just change up all the time is brilliant. And I think in the last episode, we just saw pretty much an acting masterclass from Lawrence Fishburne. Everyone's great in this show. Mads Mikkelsen is amazing. Hugh Dancy is amazing. Caroline de Havilland is fucking phenomenal. But Lawrence Fishburne, when he's actually losing his wife and the moments afterwards and the sort of realisation that he now has to pursue Hannibal, it's incredible. You feel every bit of it with him. You feel the heartache that he feels. You know that this is the one person that he knew he was going to lose but didn't want to. And you really felt for him in this last scene with Bella. So yeah, I think it's a great start to this season, and I really cannot wait to get into more of it. I'm gutted that it's finishing, and I'm really, really hopeful for a 4th season. Fuck me if Ted Lasso can get a 4th season and that was a perfect ending. This needs one. But anyway, I'm done for today. So, I hope you're all doing well out there. Please come over and subscribe to Patreon. Looking at my actual app today, I've seen that maybe I will be eligible for ads on Spotify soon, which is great, because that means that it will obviously help this podcast as well. So, I don't know what I'll do. I'll maybe have to put this behind a paywall on Patreon as well to secure that people don't have to listen to ads, but I don't know yet. I don't know how many there are going to be, so we'll see when the actual statistics come through. But anyway, as for today, I'm done, so thank you all for listening. Next episode is going to be Ginny and Georgia, Season 2, and as always, until next time, I will speak to you soon. Bye. And that is it for now, amigos. And yes, I am as angry as you are at me for that sentence, but I hope you enjoyed the show and had some fun along the way. It means a lot that you are listening and supporting me. This is an independent podcast after all, and doesn't get a lot of backing, so it is great to know that you're out there, you're listening, and if you want to come talk to me on any of the platforms I'm on, just come say hi. I'm on Instagram, I'm on Twitter, and I'm even a little bit on TikTok. I don't post that much, but I'm on there. And you can also drop comments in the comment sections on any of the platforms: Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Podbean, wherever you get your podcasts from. But as always, thank you for your time, and I will speak to you soon.